the Sinn Féin MLA, former hunger striker Pat Sheehan, with us this morning. Morning to you, Pat.
Morning, Stephen.
Good morning. What do you make of this?
Well, you've already stated yourself, Stephen, that the hunger strike is a historical fact. In fact, on the day that Bobby Sands was elected as a member of the British Parliament, it was the single biggest news story on this planet. In the days before social media, 24-hour news stations and so on, this was the single biggest story. Now, why should we not be recording historical fact? It's probably the most significant historical event over the past 50 years, the hunger strike. And whether you agree with Bobby Sands or disagree, it's historical fact that should be recorded. The bravery of Bobby Sands, I think, would be recognised by any objective person. You know, for example, I disagree with the First World War. I think it was a complete disaster and a waste of life. But for those men who went up over the top of the trenches into almost certain death, I have nothing but the utmost respect and admiration for the courage that those men showed. So, you know, maybe Tom, when he's talking about people who are regarded as heroes within our community, someone who was elected in the constituency that he now represents should maybe think that there are other people who have a different view, and there's no reason why that shouldn't be reflected in art.
For those people, Pat Sheehan, who don't get it, right? Be it because of their age, be it because of whatever. Why was the hunger strike so important to people like you?
Well, first of all, at the time, Margaret Thatcher, who was the British Prime Minister, said that the hunger strikers had no support and that the IRA had no support and that the prisoners were criminals. Now, Bobby Sands' election blew that argument completely out of the water. And the strategy that the British government had adopted up until that point was the marginalisation and isolation of Republicans. Republicans broke out of that, helped, of course, by the election of Bobby Sands and then the entry of Sinn Féin into electoral politics and the growth of support from that point. It convinced many Republicans that electoral politics could be another side of struggle, excuse me, and it also convinced people within the British establishment that their attempts to isolate and marginalise Republicans were failing. So that's the significance of it in the context of the history of the conflict here. And I had the great privilege in 2001 of meeting Nelson Mandela in Johannesburg, and he spoke glowingly of Bobby Sands, and he told me of what an inspiration Bobby Sands had been to them in prison in Robben Island during the apartheid regime.
Many days were you on hunger strike for?
I was on hunger strike for 55 days, Stephen. I was critically ill. I weighed about 7.5 stone. I was almost totally blind. I could have made out individuals coming into the room, but wouldn't have been able to identify them. And I probably had, 24, 48 hours left to live.
And what were you were taking water and that was it?
That was it, Steve.
For 55
days.
So whether people disagree or agree with you, that's clearly a sign of conviction.
Absolutely. No person could do what Bobby Sands and 9 other men did unless they were absolutely convinced of the justness of the cause.
What took you? What took you? These are open questions, Pat. I simply don't know. Okay, this part of the story of Northern Ireland. Okay, the detail. So, what took you off the hunger strike?
Well, at one point during the hunger strike, the families began to intervene. The law was that once a hunger striker lapsed into unconsciousness, his next of kin could order medical intervention. Now, the whole idea of hunger strike is to put pressure on your political opponent, to put moral pressure on them to resolve whatever injustice is there. What happened was the mother of one of the hunger strikers intervened to save his life when he lapsed into unconsciousness. That then put pressure on other families. So rather than the pressure being on our political opponents, the pressure then switched onto the families. And that was an obstacle that we couldn't overcome. And at that stage, it was decided that the hunger strike would end. The hunger strikers themselves had no role in that decision. That was taken by the leadership within the prison.
Do you think it was a defeat in the end?
No, certainly not. And anything but defeat. I think the criminalisation policy was blown completely out of the water, and the outworkings of that are there to be seen today. I mean, Republicans, former prisoners, former hunger strikers. I mean, you have myself, you have Raymond McCartney, another former hunger striker. Jerry Kelly was on hunger strike for almost 250 days in England in the 1970s. So, we're there. We're part of the executive and part of the assembly, and there are many former prisoners there. So the criminalisation policy...
How can you be on hunger strike for 270 days?
250 days. Well, because he was being force-fed at the time. The policy in England was that prisoners were force-fed. A tube was shoved down their throat and liquid gruel poured into their stomach. In fact, you may or may not know, Stephen, that two IRA volunteers died on hunger strike in England in the 1970s, Frank Stagg and Michael Gaughan, who were hunger stricken to be repatriated here to England. One of them died as a result of the tube actually being forced into his lung and the liquid feed being poured into his lungs. So he was effectively drowned by those who were trying to force feed him.
Do you have any long-term effects
no,
from having done that? Health effects?
No.
Or indeed psychological effects?
Well, I mean, probably for other people to judge whether there were any psychological effects, but certainly physically I was very, very lucky. I made a complete recovery. But there were others who survived the hunger strike who weren't so lucky. Some had psychological difficulties and others have been left with physical repercussions of the length of time they were on hunger strike.
There will be some people screaming at the radio this morning that, what I've done is I've asked you to tell the story here. And I've suggested that some people would see this very much as men of conviction. But others will be screaming at the radio saying, hold on a minute, let's just remember here how many people the IRA killed, blew up, maimed. Those victims didn't have a chance, did they, to decide whether they were going to go on any type of strike. They were blown to bits. They were murdered in cold blood. And that's what some people will be screaming at the radio this morning, that we need to be very careful here before we start to even contemplate allowing some people to interpret this as some type of glorification of a brave story.
Well, Stephen, we were involved in a conflict. It was a long and bloody conflict, and there were people killed and injured on all sides. On the Nationalist and Republican side, the Unionist Loyalist side, the British side, and people who didn't regard themselves as any of the above. And that's the nature of conflict. People do get killed. It's a brutal and bloody exercise that we wish none of us had ever been involved in.
It's nearly too easy to say that, isn't it? It's too easy to say that. That's the nature of conflict. People get killed. Come on, Pat.
Stephen, here's the point. None of us here alive today created the conditions that the conflict existed in. I mean, I grew up in a unionist area. All my friends as a kid were unionists. When I was 15, unionists came to kill me. They actually asked for me by name. And the upshot of that was that we had to up and leave our house the very next morning. So while victimhood doesn't sit easily on my shoulders, certainly my family was affected by the conflict. And many others, many friends of mine were killed and injured during the conflict. So,
what were you in jail for?
I was in jail for causing an explosion when I was on hunger strike in the centre of town. I was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment at that time.
So what's that mean, causing an explosion? Planting a bomb or what? What's that mean?
A bomb was placed in the premises. People were warned a bomb was there. Everyone was evacuated and no one was injured. So it was part of a commercial bombing campaign that the IRA was carrying in Belfast at that time.
Did you plant that bomb?
Well, I was involved in it, yes.
In a shop or where?
It was in a cash and carry premises.
See when you're actually carrying that device, Pat, and you're leaving it in the heart of a city where there are women, children, men, innocent people who you could not describe as a combatant. How do you set it down? I know you say there's a warning, but you know there are risks with any type of explosive device. So how do you actually set that down and look around you and there's kids laughing and there's women, and children? How do you do that?
Well, I'll answer that question, Stephen, but I want to ask you a question. Would you ask the same question to a pilot of a British warplane who is dropping bombs or firing missiles over Iraq or Syria or somewhere like that, where many, many more kids are being killed, where bombs are being dropped, from 30,000 feet in the air? I mean, I went into a premises. Yeah,
but there is a difference. There is a difference, Pat, isn't there? And by the way, it is a question that I should ask. So I absolutely give you that, okay?
Yeah.
And it's a question I should ask, and the next time I have one of those people on, I will ask them it.
Yeah.
But there is a difference, isn't there, between dropping a bomb from 30 feet on high and the proximity that there is in carrying something on the ground in your own hand, looking around you, and a couple of feet away from you, there are kids and women, and you can still set it down and run off and leave it there to go off.
Yeah.
How do you? I just want to understand where the humanity disappears in terms of thinking to yourself, now if that goes off and that little kid there's blown to smithereens, how do you go to bed that night?
Well, I think first of all, I would make a general point, Stephen, that in war, humanity in all of us who are involved in conflict is reduced. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And it's nothing that anybody should be proud about or boast about in any way. But it's a fact of life that, to go out and carry out an operation, whether it's to kill someone or to blow a place up or anything else, it requires you to suppress the humanity that's instinctively in all of us. And there's no doubt about that, and I recognise that.
And when you look back on it now, is it? I'm genuinely trying to have an open conversation with this today. I'm genuinely not judging you, okay? And you're right. There are many questions could be asked of others. But when you look back on it now, with the benefit of not just hindsight but age, do you regret it? Do you feel uneasy about it?
Well, there are many things that happened during the conflict that I'm uneasy about. There are some things I'm even ashamed about that the IRA were involved in. But I'm not ashamed of the fact that I was involved in a conflict. I was involved in resistance against what many, many people believe to be an oppressive state and an oppressive regime here in Ireland. And many of us believed that we didn't have a peaceful political alternative. Now, we could argue all day about whether that existed or didn't exist, but what we believed at the time was that it didn't exist. We saw the civil rights. Remember, I was a young kid at 10, 11, 12 years of age growing up when the civil rights marchers were battened off the street, when Bloody Sunday happened, when internment happened. All of those things. And people will ask you, well, why did you end up joining the IRA? And I can't point to any one specific incident. But what I can say is this. I mean, I grew up in an environment where life was cheap, and where the state was involved in massive repression against ordinary people. So, all of these things happen. If I could change things and go back and things could be resolved peacefully, would I want that? Of course I would want it. Do you think I wanted to be on hunger strike? Did I want to be in jail? Not at all. And I certainly didn't want to be involved in ruining other people's lives. But that's the fact of the conflict that we were involved in. And instead of, harping back about who did this and who did that, we should be looking forward to the future, not to forget the past, and not to, especially to forget about victims and what they suffered in the conflict. But we need, in many ways, to try and walk in each other's shoes, to try and think about what the other experienced. and try.
Well, that's
and
why
move
I'm asking
forward
these.
and build a better society.
That's why I'm asking you these questions today. That's why I'm listening to you.
Yeah. So, but if it was possible to change, I mean, I don't remember the exact quote the Queen made in Dublin, but she said there were things that happened that should never have happened, so. If I could change things, I'd love to be able to, go back and change it all. But
just finally, to come back to this so-called comic novel, do you think it would be fair game for the Arts Council to fund a comic novel for Michael Stone?
Well, you see, I heard Tom Elliott when he was on there, and he said art shouldn't be controversial. And many people would totally disagree with that statement.
So how about answering that question?
Well, I'm going to answer it. Many people would believe that art should be cutting edge, and whether it's about, some aspect of Republican history or Loyalist history or whatever, and I would have no difficulty. If the Arts Council feel that there's a project in terms of its worthiness, in terms of its art to be funded, I don't care what it's about or who it's about, and I think if we try to censor art, then we get into another completely different argument altogether. I mean, we're talking about this because it's seen to be controversial by a certain element within the community here. But as I say, some people think art should be cutting edge, and it has a statement to make, and the artists are the ones who should be, out to the fore, cutting edge, in the vanguard. So, in terms of Michael Stone, I don't care if the Arts Council funds a comic about Michael Stone, if it's worthy in terms of its art.
Okay. Really interesting talking to you today, Pat. Thank you very much indeed. That's Pat Sheehan, the Sinn Féin MLA.